So, back to normal topics kind of a little bit
Yeah, we've
today.
had this one in the books for a while of wanting to do this episode talking about childhood in America, and we had to kind of put it off for several weeks because week to week it seems like the world continues to spiral out of control. But this week, even though there was a huge historical event yesterday, as the sitting president was impeached twice now,
Donald J. Trump is the only president in U.S. history to be impeached twice.
impeached twice, so. We're gonna just veer away from that kind of stuff though and get to a like more, I guess, normal-ish topic. But I'm excited about this one because there's a lot to say.
There is when I was researching for today, I ended up in a very odd place.
So did
Um,
I. Which
and
era did you end up in?
I have an argument I want to make about child labor, organized labor, and the 20th century.
Okay, I'm excited because I got bogged down in the early years, which is not uncommon for me when I'm set off to research something.
Right.
I end up like way, way far back. But so I think we're going to have it covered. But I'm really excited because there are a lot of arguments and discussions to be had about what childhood even means and how that
Hmm.
changes over time, right? I mean, right now, let me ask you a question.
Well, let's
Maybe we should do our
let,
intro music. Do the intro music.
yeah. Welcome to an incomplete history.
I'm Hillary,
And I'm Jeff.
and we're your hosts for this weekly history podcast.
So kind of before we get into it, how's the weather in Mississippi?
It's sunny and a little chilly, like in the 50s, but it's a nice day out. We had a really exciting weather event this week. I'm sad we didn't record on this day. There was snow, actual real life snow, not a flurry. We probably got, I don't know, about an inch or so. We were able to make a full snowman, and the kids played outside all day, and it was really cool.
Did you sing the song?
About Frosty?
No, well, did you sing that song?
The girls did, yeah, and they named the snowman Frosty, and I was like, oh, how original, but they were really excited.
Did no, the other song, Do You Want to Build a Snowman? I know how much you love Frozen.
I've eradicated Frozen from this household by pointing
It's been
out how
canceled.
stupid it is. Yeah, it's been canceled because, and now the girls are just like, yeah, that's a baby show. It is a
Oh.
baby show. I really hate Frozen.
It's 80 degrees here today.
That's what I heard. That is very warm for January, but
It
that's
is
great.
about 10 to 15 degrees warmer than it should be. I mean, we should be having nice weather, but this is a little too nice.
It's a little toasty.
It's not really. I mean, 80 degrees feels fine. Um, but
But
yeah,
it's
welcome
toasty for
to our.
January, right? I mean,
It
that's
is
that's a little.
like they expect tomorrow. Maybe we might set some record highs. Yep. Welcome to the world of global climate change.
I saw an article today that came across that said that we really have increased in temperature significantly. I mean, because there was all these new, studies come out at the beginning of the year, and it said that we've got a real situation going right now. So,
Yep.
I mean, we know that anyway.
So, so we're back to kind of, I don't know, less controversial topics unless you're paying attention.
We can make this controversial.
We can make it controversial. And the whole thing is there's a moment of controversy in the 19th and 20th century that just floors me that it was controversial. Like, I'm just like, how was this controversial? But we're going to be talking about childhood in America today.
So I wanted to start by asking you a question, and I got ahead of
Mhm.
myself in the first minute, but
We're
how
excited to talk about this.
I'm so excited. I have like notes on notes. Um, how old is a child today? Like, how do you how old do you think you are until you're an adult right now in 2021? And I'm not talking legally. I'm asking you just in general, when do you think you stop being a child in this country now?
I mean, you're talking to someone who teaches freshmen.
I know, I know. So when do you think?
Here's the thing. Sometimes I think my freshmen, who are mostly 18 and 19 years old, sometimes I think they're definitely adults. Sometimes I think they're still children. Um, I can understand where kind of legal adulthood happens somewhere between 17 and 21. I understand the argument for that because I think actual adulthoods happen somewhere in there as well. Um, and I think it's different for different kids too. I think some kids, by the time they're 16 or 17, are acting much more mature than many adults.
That's true, and it depends on their economic circumstances oftentimes, which
Yeah,
we know goes all the way back, right?
but I
Children
think it's
working.
reverse. Right. I think it's an inverse thing, right? I think the lower a child's socioeconomic level, the more likely they are to be mature at an earlier age.
Oh, absolutely, because they're forced to be earners for their families.
Well, they don't have the luxury of a prolonged childhood.
They don't have the luxury. That's right, because childhood is a luxury. And our, I mean, it's a luxury that is new. We've not had this whole idea of like what it means to be a child until relatively recently.
So, I mean, so childhood in America, let's go way, way back to kind of Puritan New England.
Okay, so can I go here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
I
mean, first, can we talk about the creepy paintings of children from then?
Yeah. Well, oftentimes they would be painted as like adults, but in teeny little
But
bodies,
little.
like adult faces on little teeny baby bodies. It's very weird. Art during the, you know, I'm thinking like the 17th century because I'm thinking of
Yeah.
like the colonial period. It's very weird. But it's not though when you think about the way that children are treated. They're not they are kind of treated from the time they're little as little adults and they're expected to act like little adults. Like they're just considered like stunted, like, oh, they'll get there, but we're going to just treat them that way anyway, as if they're adults. And so when I started reading about childhood in the colonial era, I learned, well, I knew this a little bit, but I learned it more fully is that children were largely responsible for settlement in the American colonies, that many of the people who were sent as indentured servants, whether voluntarily or not, were under the age of 19, and that children have worked all along, um, this entire time. And so, one of the things that struck me as troubling was that it was an intentional plan. So like they wanted children to come here and the people settling would write, so like the Virginia governor would write to other governors in London, and there, I have this primary source document where he's talking about like, can you send 100 more kids to us? The 100 that you sent last year were great. Some of them died on the way over, but it'd be great if you could send us some more kids. And it became so clear to me that like most of these children were indentured against their will. A lot of times when we think of indentured servitude or apprenticeship, it's like, oh, they're teaching them something and the kids get to pick their trade. Sometimes, but sometimes they were actually going and picking kids up off the street who were orphaned or destitute or coming from poor families, putting them on ships and sending them across the ocean to work without any consent.
Well, I mean, in England at the time, you have like an urban crisis with population and children as well. And this is where you get kind of famous illustrations of like how debauched the lower classes are in England. And you see kind of these drunken women with like babies falling out of their arms and busting their heads open and stuff. That there's this idea that the lower class in England cannot take care of itself, nor can they take care of their children. And there's nowhere for these children to go. There's nothing for them to do. So we might as well send them somewhere where we can do something.
So they
Right.
thought they were solving a social problem, which I guess in a way, it from our 21st century eye seems very cruel They're like, well, we're going to give them the opportunity to go to this new place to work and then to be, given land and some clothing, and then they can start their own lives. Because, yeah, there's this idea that the lower class cannot take care of their children. And so they're going to be given a different life and a different opportunity. But oftentimes, what would happen is the kids were kidnapped. So they
Right.
called the kidnappers spiriters. And they would say, oh, the child was spirited away, which sounds like whimsical, but it means they were kidnapped. Um, and so these kidnappers or spiriters would get healthy profits for each suitable child that they could find wandering the streets. And it was a custom that people would just kind of wander the streets of more destitute areas throughout London and other areas and just go around collecting children. You come here, you come here, you come here. And people's kids were disappearing off the streets. One man was looking for his 11-year-old son. This was in the 1660s, and he obtained a warrant to search a ship that was bound for the American colonies, and he was looking for his 11-year-old son. And he claimed, my son had been kidnapped or spirited away. The search ended up uncovering 19 different servants, 11 whom had been taken involuntarily or spirited, kidnapped off the street against their will. And so this trade of children was happening at the same time as the African slave trade, and in somewhat similar ways where they're being kidnapped, but then they were doing different things, right? So they were indentured and apprenticed, and that there was an idea of at a certain point they can become free, but they were still being kidnapped with no consent. This created, an outrage. I mean, a lot of people thought that this wasn't right. Charles II in 1664, he established a central registry which ended up recording the contracts of all servants leaving the colonies. So that way it started to be written down. Who is leaving? Why are they leaving? Where are they going? So they could start keeping some records of it, because there was some outrage over the kids being taken, but pretty common practice in the 17th century.
So why? I mean, here's the thing, and this is kind of what historians we do. You uncover documents like that, and you sit back and you start to try to figure out why were children such an attractive group and an in-demand group to bring over. And I think it's very similar to what we're going to talk about later with the 19th and early 20th century with child labor.
Well,
Is
they're easy
children
to
are
control.
they're easy to control. They're small. They're physically not they're you don't have to worry as much about them physically overwhelming you.
They're nimble,
They're nimble. They have small hands, which becomes really important in the 19th century.
right, during the industrial era.
But
And
there are things that it's been decided they can do that it's maybe a little bit harder for adults to do. But I think the most important thing is this idea that they are very pliable,
yeah. Well, and now
malleable.
there's nothing else for them to do, it seems, right? So if they're being taken from these urban environments and their parents can't feed them, and they're not working and they're not working alongside their parents or something, they're just kind of wandering around. And this, ends up being also a story about education and how important compulsory education becomes into more like the 19th century, where kids start just going to school and learning from young ages. That's not the case right now.
Right.
People from really upper classes, of course, are educating their children, teaching them to read arithmetic, or they're being sent away. But by and large, the majority of the population is not being formally educated. So you have kids that are just wandering around with kind of nothing to do. So they say, well, we'll
Mhm.
give you something to do.
Well, and in a Puritan context, there's another problem with children. In Puritan communities in New England is, and I will never forget this. A professor you and I both had when we were completing our doctoral work used to talk about this, right? That children were a high source of anxiety among kind of staunch Puritans in New England because they had assembled these communities of saints, right? The communities, they had assembled kind of this community of God, and then they have these children in it. And you don't know what a child certainly seems to be susceptible to Satan's whims.
Right, because kids, they see them as troublemakers or naughty or yeah, more exactly, more susceptible, but they also think that children are more connected to like a spiritual world or that they're more susceptible to listening maybe to like the devil tempting them or things like that. And it
which
does
is very
create crisis.
which is very similar to women, right?
Well, when left to our own devices, what to
Well,
do?
women, right? But the Puritans viewed women as what was the word? Spongy, that they would soak up whatever was around them. And that could be good things, but it could also be bad things like Satan's influence.
Right, because women are treated much like children. But the idea is that we're malleable just like children because we can't
Mhm.
come up with our own ideas or make our own decisions. And so unless we are put to work with very specific tasks and kept busy all day, we may wander off and commune with the devil.
Mhm. And this, I mean, children figure prominently in 1692, the Salem witch trials.
Well, isn't that old saying to idle hands are the devil's handiwork?
Oh, yeah.
Right? That's the whole
The
idea.
tool of the devil. Yeah. I mean, and you know, you want to learn more about the Salem witch trials, see our Halloween episode. But I think that is something right there. The fact that children occupy a central position in what happens in Salem in 1692 is a real, it reveals the anxiety about these children. And I think combining that with kind of Jamestown's demand for more children is a very interesting thing because I think it shows that we are not to a place where children are kind of the center of family life. You know, we talked a little about this in our Christmas episode. They are not at all. In fact, in many ways, they're viewed as very disrupting.
Well, they're a necessary evil at this point, right? There's no, good ways to control their being born, right? Like there's no good birth control methods necessarily. People do want to have children. You're not going to stop people from having sex. And they know that at some point the children are going to be very helpful. And so it's kind of like seen as a necessary evil, especially during infancy, because children really are totally useless during infancy. But they start putting kids to work at really young ages. Basically,
Mhm.
whenever a kid could carry something, they were put to work. And toddlers can carry stuff. They would have kids as young as 3 carrying firewood. Um, but so I think they were considered a necessary evil for
Well,
people in the colonial era.
right. Well, in particular, I think when you start to have kind of agriculture really take off in the colonies and later the early United States, anybody who's ever lived on or near a farm or been around farms knows that there's an incredible amount of physical labor that has to be performed. And some of it you don't need a great amount of strength to do. You just need to do it. So children are an essential component to this. And this is why you see kind of rural farm families, the average number of children in the family goes way up because that's labor.
Right. So that's certainly true. And I think that that's still true today, really. A lot of people who are more rural tend to have a few more kids than people who are not. And I'm saying that too from experience, like watching some of the communities around here. There are still kids who work on farms.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's not that they're not going to school, although I can't say for certain. I think a lot of them are homeschooled, but there's a lot of kids who work on farms around here.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, when I was in high school, there were farms that some kids would do chores around the farm before they get up at like 4 a.m. in the morning to do all their stuff on the farm before they went to school.
So that's what's crazy, right? When school does come into the mix, that's just an added bit of labor for the kids because it's not like their chores go away. They just have to get up earlier to do them. And we can talk about that later because
Right.
to me, that's where it gets controversial.
But I think it's also this idea that you don't want a child to have too much free time on their hands
But
because they're
it's
going
like
to get in
4 in the
trouble.
morning. They would be asleep.
Who knows? But I think it's maybe why parents pack their children's schedules today too.
That's true. That's true. It's with different stuff. And then the way that we value children today and the ways that we try to make their lives so perfect and everything, a lot of it though does go back to they're never idle. They're always doing something. They're signed up. They go to school and then they have after school extracurricular. They have music lessons, sporting events, theater, whatever it is. You just pack their schedule and then they're so exhausted by the end of the day that they sleep. And there's something probably connected there, right? Of like never
Mhm.
allowing the idle hands.
Mhm. I think so. I think so. So, I mean, we've gotten beyond the early colonial period. Let's get to kind of the revolutionary period. Um, this is not the last time I'm going to mention Walt Disney. I think Walt Disney is going to come up 3 times today. Um, but Walt Disney has this great TV movie, I guess, because I don't think it may have been released theatrically after it premiered on the Wonderful World of Disney, called The Liberty Story. And it features the story of Johnny Tremaine,
Oh,
who's
right.
this
Yeah. Uh-huh.
boy in Boston who's apprenticed to a silversmith. Um, it's pretty good, actually. It's honestly, as an historian, I don't sit there and squirm completely. It it actually does a pretty good job of representing some things. Um, but he's an apprentice and a silversmith, and he ends up getting involved in the revolution. Um, but the thing is, the tasks that he's given are very much tasks that would have been given children, that are very similar to the other tasks children start to do at the very early uh, period of the American Republic or the end of the Revolution, which include things they're called street jobs, right? Street trades, I think
Right.
is the more formal term for them. Which by the 19th century becomes things like newspapers, delivering newspapers. The end of the 19th century becomes delivering telegrams, shining boots, shining shoes, running errands, whatever duties are demanded. But this is kind of Johnny, this is what he does during the revolution, is he kind of does just whatever is demanded of him. Um,
There's a lot of
and
jobs to do during the war.
there's a lot of jobs, and these jobs are considered necessary but beneath the adult men.
Right. And kids are easy to kind of just slide into those positions. There's nothing stopping them from being like street vendors or drummer boys or passing out newspapers or what have you. I mean, it makes sense really if you have all these things to do, who's going to do it? Well, a kid could. Gives them a
But I
sense of purpose.
Right, but I think the opposite, the flip side of that I think is very interesting is Johnny is an apprentice, and I think this apprenticeship thing um, becomes the story for quite a while, because you've got these children basically that are apprenticed at a very early age, and he gets apprenticed because he's an orphan. But many of them get apprenticed at an early age, and they basically stay in that position, theoretically learning a trade for decades. And in fact, we get kind of at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, we get a real revolt against that apprenticeship system.
It just ends up being unpaid labor because
Right.
if you think about like the purpose of an apprenticeship, it makes really good sense, right? If you're going to need to learn a skill and you're going to have to go out into the world and earn at some point, you might as well start learning it when you're young if there's no compulsory education, right? It
Mhm.
makes good sense, but then they start taking advantage of it. Exactly. Well, we're just
You
going to
have
keep
20,
these kids
right? You
around.
have 26-year-old men who are still apprentices, right?
Right.
Um, but apprenticeship reminds me of when we were teaching assistants. Zing. Um,
We were learning a
but
trade, Jeffrey.
did you get any real instruction?
No, none whatsoever.
Exactly. So it's complete BS, right? I mean, we could have a whole series about how higher education is so broken. But I mean, what's interesting is it is not strictly an American phenomenon that childhood starts to be developed in the 19th century.
Well, and
It's happening in multiple
it's connected to
places.
what we've been talking about, though, in several episodes about the cult of domesticity, where
Hmm.
the home space starts to be cultivated by women, because men are off working away from the home, not in the farms, and women start to cultivate this domestic space, and children are at the heart of it.
Would you say children are at the heart or the wife is at the heart?
Well, the wife's at the heart, but children are very much a part of that domestic space.
Right.
And, okay, so here's what I would say. I skipped a part there. It used to be that children were completely under control of the father, completely. For work assignments, they belonged to the father. They were like accessories to him, much like the wife was. But that begins to shift into the 19th century, where women start to be more in charge of the children. And that's kind of weird to think about, that there was ever a time where that wasn't the case, because, of course, women carry the children and birth the children and feed the children. You would think they would always be under the supervision or guidance of the mother, but that's not the case. Not until into the 19th century do women start to take charge of the children in the house.
Well, in an ideal model, right? I mean, here's the thing
In a
is I
middle
think if
class
you
model.
right, I think if you went to some kind of lower socioeconomic situations, you might find something very different. But what I think find is interesting is women are able to kind of start to assume control over children, but the control is a very passive aggressive control.
What do you
The
mean
one
by
that moral suasion. So moral suasion becomes the ideal way for a mother to influence her children becomes through moral suasion. So if Johnny's out, drinking and gambling and doing terrible things that a boy shouldn't be doing, the mother doesn't directly confront Johnny. What she does, and this just cracks me up, what she does is she arranges for Johnny to spy her on, like kneeling at her bed, praying fervently to God to correct Johnny's ways, and like tears streaming down her face because he's broken her heart and all these things. It becomes this really messed up passive aggressive way to control children.
You just described my mother-in-law.
But I think this becomes the model for a long time, that it's viewed as unseemly for a woman to directly confront a child about bad behavior, whereas the father comes home and immediately does it. And this is why I think even into the 1950s, you see an ideal family model where it's always like, well, wait till your father gets home. Because I think it's a hangover from that kind of, at the end of the day, the husband slash father calls all the shots. But I think it's very, this moral suasion, and look it up. There are some great things that have been written about moral suasion. It's so weird. Um, I mean,
Also, because it's appealing to something higher than just like, because women oftentimes, this is what I would say, is that women oftentimes are not listened to when they directly say something. And so women have for centuries had to find workarounds to get their voice heard. And so that's just one way, if so say a mother went to their son and was like, "You're doing blah 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 blah." He would say, "You're nagging me."
mhm.
And not listen, right? So like this is a workaround where the the mother's like, I'll talk to Jesus about how upset I am over the son's behavior, and then attempt to like alter the behavior by appealing to their morals. I don't know if it's right, but to me it seems very indicative of somebody trying to seek power or persuasion who's coming from a very, very limited role with limited abilities to actually do that. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely think it does. I mean, and I think the cult of domesticity. We have to talk about Republican motherhood alongside of it. That that the ideal father at this point has structured a Republican miniature in the household, but then has activities outside the household to kind of conduct. But the Republican mother, and we're talking little r Republican here.
He has nothing
The
to do with
Republic,
politics.
right? The Republican mother is at home instilling Republican values in her children.
Republican values, meaning of citizenship, being a good citizen, being a good
Right.
person, right? And so
Um,
this woman's left to tend to that portion of the household.
virtue.
Yeah, virtue. And she's been kind of deputized by the husband, but not fully.
And
There's
that's the
not an
thing.
equal. They don't carry equal power. They never do, right?
Right. But I think that's a great word, deputize, because you know, even when you're deputized, you don't have the full power of the party that deputized you. And I think that's a really good way to view it, is that the husband deems her capable of dealing with things to a point, but at the end of the day, he has the final call, because I think this is still a period where we have coverture for women, right? Where women still can't do things like initiate divorces. In many places, they can't own property outright themselves. They definitely can't vote. I mean, there's all these kind of restrictions on their activities.
Well, and at
Uh,
the end of the day, in case of a divorce or separation, which is not very common, the children will still go to the father at this point.
yeah.
Even though the wife has kind of taken over some of the domestic duties and the raising of the children by this time, at the end of the day, she still does not have legal rights to her own children. The father does.
And that persists until the post war period.
Yeah. And it's funny because now I think people automatically say, oh, the mother gets all of the rights to the kids. And not really. Not really. I think courts tend to favor mothers in certain cases, and I know that everybody has an anecdotal piece of evidence to say that the mother is favored, but oftentimes now I think it's more of a 50-50 thing, but historically speaking really never been that way. It's always just been the father. So the pendulum, may be swinging, but historically it's never been in favor of the mother. This is a more recent development in the 21st century, 20th and 21st, right?
Right. Right. So the 19th century is the moment where things start to really change, I would argue, where childhood really, as we understand it today, starts to be invented.
Yes, and it's invented based on social class.
It is the clearest way to say I am middle class.
Yeah, my children don't have to work. We can provide a childhood for them, and all of you poor paupers who make their children work are depriving them of a childhood and are obviously too poor to get by.
Well, it's right, and the first step is my wife does not have to work because we don't need that income,
Yeah.
and my children don't need to work. If I encounter somebody where either of those things are happening, where either the wife or children are working, I know I am of a superior moral class to them.
A superior moral class, but also just in general, I am a higher social class than that person
Hmm.
because I make more money than that person. And this is all, by the way, just like capitalism at its finest, right? It's the
Well, yeah, this is
basing your
capitalism.
values off of that. It's our country, yeah.
Because here's the thing. So you've got this middle class father whose wife is not working, his children aren't working, and he may be investing some money, and he's investing in money in factories that at the very same moment are employing children to work in the factory,
Well,
and women,
preying on lower
and
class
women.
families and women. Yeah, absolutely. But that's part of the status.
Uh-huh.
And you're thinking too about like where is this explosion of factory development?
It's New England.
Right. And in the early 19th century, what happens in New England right along the time when these, you know, factories kind of explode? It's they ban slavery and the slave trade and
Hmm.
enslaving people, but then they just take on a whole new business model of bringing in very, very poor women and children to work in factories for nothing.
Yeah.
Is
Well,
that illegal?
well, I think it's industrialization causes this need for a huge, cheap, easily controlled labor pool.
And
And
I want to clarify, I'm not equating slavery in this, not at all. But I'm saying that
well,
there's a void in the labor market. And so then they fill it by employing
right.
children.
Here's the thing though, some people at the time who are critics of the wage labor system do compare it to slavery. And in some apologists for slavery actually go so far as to say the slave system in the South is superior to the wage labor system that's developing in the North.
Okay, that's wild. I've heard people make that argument. I would
Well,
never
you can
equate
see
them
it.
or
You
say
can
that.
see you read these editorials they write, and they write books, and this is where they start to kind of develop the whole myth of the benevolent master kind of sitting amongst the slaves on Sunday listening to a sermon and doing things like that, because they argue at the end of the day the factory owner doesn't care at all about his employees
Right,
because there's
and
so
that the
many that
argument
can.
is the plantation owner does care
Right,
about his slaves
right.
and then feeds them and clothes them and all that. I think that that's totally
But there
sick.
is this, but I mean, that's the thing is by the middle of the 19th century, you have this head to head conflict between slave labor and wage labor. Um, Even one of the people who kind of writes a seminal text that influences people to support abolishing slavery, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She's a huge supporter of wage labor, and she actually doesn't care whether wage laborers are treated well.
And oftentimes wage laborers aren't given enough wages to live just to even scrape by, right? We've had a lot of discussions about like the scraping
Hmm.
by thesis and all of that. And to me, what's crazy is like they're both bad.
Hmm.
Humans aren't being treated properly. And to say, well, we're going to get rid of one evil and then now we're morally superior because we got rid of that one evil, but then we're going to perpetuate another type of evil, and now we're just morally superior. It's crazy how that happens, and we see that time and time again throughout history, right? Where there's like these two warring sides. Well, this is bad, and it's like one is like slightly better than the other or better than the other, but it's still not great. But then that side wins out, and then we think, okay, it's over, we're won.
So by the end of the 19th century, we've got children and women working in factories, but you've also got the rise of an organized labor movement. And organized labor very early on decides groups like women and children make it harder for them to demand concessions from factory owners. Is
Because the
that a fair
factory owners
statement?
really don't care about the women and the children.
Right. And they're easily controllable. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say so because the labor unrest and the beginning of like these labor unions and stuff, it's bloody and it's violent, and they don't really want the women and the children out on the front lines of that necessarily. But then other arguments start happening where middle class white women come in to be saviors to the women and the children and say we need to get them out of this environment. But no, I think it's fair to say that they don't really want women in part of the movement anyway, because it's a really contentious environment and they don't want women in part of it.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the middle class reformers, because here you've got women in the middle class. So they have no kind of real labor demands on them because they have servants at home to do domestic labor. They don't have to go out and work. Their children, they have kind of nannies and things to take care of their children. They're overseeing it all, but at the end of the day, they have a lot of free time. And these women read and they start to talk with one another. And they actually, one of the things they do is they decide to go out and make the lives of lower class people better. And one of the ways they decide to do that is to go out and dictate how you should be a proper mother, which I
Well, they
think
have
is
a lot of
ironic.
well, they have a lot of moral reform ideas, right? As they sit
Mhm.
around, these club women, they have lives of leisure. They sit around, other people are raising their kids, like you mentioned. They sit around and talk about all that's wrong with the world. And they come down to these, we get these major moral reforms in the early 20th century as a result of these women's clubs, really. And it's like, people need to stop drinking, people need to stop whoring around, and we need to get kids out of the factories. That's how we'll make the world a better place. And so you see major pushes towards prohibition of alcohol, major pushes towards cracking down on sex work. And then you see major pushes toward getting kids out of factory life. And that is so reliant on this shift in sentiments toward children. We really shift the way we even think about kids. And this happened starting in the 19th century, but into the 20th, no doubt, we start having considerations of children's emotional needs. And it's
Mary Harris Jones,
based
Mother
on
Jones.
science. What was that?
So Mary Harris Jones, Mother Jones, she's one of the big early advocates for the plight of child workers. Here's the thing, though. I'm not sure, and this was one of the controversial things I was going to bring up. I'm not sure most of the people who are kind of leading the push to get children out of labor really are doing it for the children. I
Okay.
think she is.
What do you think they're doing
Uh,
it for?
I think Samuel Gompers is so. Samuel Gompers, American Federation of Labor, he actually wants to get children, improve their conditions working, or get them out of labor. I think the reason he wants to do it is children, as long as children are able to be kind of employed freely, it's going to hurt organized labor. So he wants to do that. Um, and I think some other people who kind of want them pushed out of the labor force want that done to make it easier for men to kind of negotiate with factory owners and employers, to kind of restrict that labor market. But what I think is interesting is so you've got an urban family, maybe an urban immigrant family, where everybody in the family is working. Suddenly, the children are kind of, we decide they shouldn't be working. That's a lot of income that family's going to lose. As little as people are being paid, it adds up.
I have the same sentiment and I arrived at the same conclusion. It kind of F's people up big time and the poorest of people because
Because, right, it demonizes a way out of poverty.
it demonizes their very way of life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then suddenly the children aren't allowed to work. The parents lose a ton of income, and you have a massive surge of orphaned children in the 1920s and 30s as a
Mm-hmm.
result of them being kicked out of the labor market.
Yeah.
They're
Well,
orphaned, they're
that's
institutionalized.
right. I mean, that's the thing is like, as long as your children could work, if you were very poor, at least they were bringing a little money in. But once they are no longer allowed to work, you want them out as fast as possible. So the first kind of step towards getting children out is 1904. The National Child Labor Committee gets formed, and it becomes one of the main catalysts for kind of trying to reform or regulate child labor, but also eventually push them out of the labor market. And I think it's useful to talk a little bit about what children did in the late 19th and early 20th century factory work-wise. So you had those street trades that I talked about before, which had long been around. But you also had factory work, and you have these huge machines, particularly the textile industry, and idle machines produce no profit. So it's important those machines are kept running constantly. So in something like the textile industry, if you've got a spinning machine that's kind of spinning thread, you don't want to shut it down because it's going to take a while to reset it and get it started up again. So you want it running as fast as possible. But things fall underneath the machine. Sometimes adjustments have to be made. Children have little hands. They're small. They can crawl under things.
Very useful.
Um,
I mean, literally,
don't
right? I mean,
worry.
it's funny, but it's also like it's true. They're little and they can
It's true.
crawl, and yeah,
So in a lot of these factories, these textile mills, children were responsible for gathering the lint that would gather under these machines because that's potential product.
well, and it's a fire hazard too if it's just sitting around like
I
that.
don't think they care about the fire hazard.
Well,
I
they
think
do, and they don't want their factory to
I guess
burn
I
down.
guess they do kind of, but I think they care more about that as potential product that's being
Sure,
lost on
sure, sure.
them. And so what if some children lose their hands in the process?
Oh my God. And that's what starts getting people really riled up, these middle class women. So there's an unintended consequence to what they're doing. I mean, some of these women are being benevolent, right? Like, we're going to come in and save these kids' lives, but then they like ruin them. But at the same time, they really are concerned about like these kids are getting hurt. They shouldn't be getting hurt. But then like what's the alternative? They end up in an orphanage, which is what happens. I don't
They
know
end
what
up in an
you thought was
orphanage.
going to happen.
Right. Right. But, well, I mean, you get compulsory education starts to get introduced, which,
But
the
that doesn't
standard
solve
out.
the problem though, because yeah, so they go to school, but they're a mouth to feed. And a lot of parents put them out. That's what they would call it, right? They would be placed out to farms who needed help or actually just put into an institution. I mean, it's really sad.
Mhm. So 1906, Albert Beveridge, he's a Republican from Indiana, introduces legislation to prevent the employment of children in factories and mines. So children were employed in mines as well. They were called breaker boys. And they were kind of given the responsibility of separating, at least in kind of Virginia or West Virginia, Kentucky, they were given the responsibility of separating coal from slate. Kind of a very time consuming job that didn't require a lot of strength. But 1906, that's introduced. We need to ban children being employed in factories and mines. And it gets debated for a while and kind of falls out and doesn't actually get approved until 1907. I mean, it takes a year for them to kind of finally decide that the Secretary of Commerce and Labor, and here's the words of the legislation, will investigate and report upon the industrial, social, moral, educational, and physical condition of women child workers in the United States. So 1907, they actually commission a study. And it is not until 1916 that we actually get something that pushes children out. And it is um, the Owen Keating Act, 1916. Do you know how the federal government argues? Do you know what the federal government argues?
What did
It's
I say?
why it can regulate children working anywhere in the United States.
I don't know.
The Commerce Clause.
Oh my gosh.
So the Commerce Clause. So 1916, they do this Owen Keating Act. Children cannot work in factories and mines. June 1918, the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional. Which I find interesting. I mean,
Well,
here's something that moral reformers have decided needs to be done, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, technically this isn't constitutional.
wow. Well, I mean, what was the motivation there though?
For the Supreme Court to do that,
Yeah.
the motivation is that they argued the Commerce Clause could not be used that expansively.
Yeah, but why wouldn't they have wanted to protect?
Well, I mean, think about what the Supreme Court looks like in 1918. They want to protect children, but they also are kind of felt that they are limited by what the Constitution does or does not permit the government to do.
Yeah. Wow, what a
Um,
time. What a time to be alive.
what a time. Imagine that. So what does Congress do next? Well, then they use taxes. Um, and there's a proposal to do a 10% tax on any industry that employs children in violation of certain age and hour standards that Congress seeks to set.
That discourages.
And well, yeah, and this is the idea is it would offset any competitive advantage industries using child labor might enjoy because of that child labor.
Yeah, so then it doesn't even make economic sense for them to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
May 1922, Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional.
Ooh. Wow.
So, I mean, this is interesting. So after this, um, people are wondering, they're like, well, how can we do this? And it's actually, so there's a child labor amendment in 1924 um, to limit, regulate, and prohibit labor of persons under 18 years of age. Um, and this is supposed to be a constitutional amendment because they actually say, look, the Supreme Court's going to continue to override these until we get in the Constitution. Obviously, that amendment fails. There is no amendment in the Constitution that limits, regulates, and prohibits persons under 18 years of age from working in certain industries. But what actually happens is it's not until the New Deal where we finally get the Fair Labor Standards Act passed.
When it ends up being
And
a
it,
state by state decision too, because
yeah,
different states have different
mhm,
child labor laws, and you can get a
yeah.
job depending on how old you are and your consent of your parents based on what state you live in and what labor you're performing.
And I think part of it, and this is, I mean, one of the stories of the New Deal is there's a large number of young men who are unemployed, roving the country.
So we got that big dam built.
Well, we got that big dam built, but there's also anxiety that we have to cater to them because if we don't,
Not cater to them,
well,
but
not cater to
employ
them,
them.
we have to address their grievances because if we don't, it might lead to big unrest. So finally, I mean, what I want to argue is this: the reason child labor is finally pushed out has nothing to do with the morality of having children work. It has to do with providing employment opportunities for men who are out of work during the Great Depression.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm inclined to agree with that it has nothing to do with the morality, but I would say that it was first brought to the attention by these outraged moral
Mhm.
reformers. Um, but I mean, the other thing is the increase in people who are going to school and compulsory education. The fact that people were having to go to school. I mean, it was the law to end up being in school by that time, right? I mean, you had to go to a certain amount of schooling. Um, there are deterrents in place to hiring children in the first place now. I mean, it's a really slow thing, but yeah, basically a lot of young men needed to work, and so they're not going to let them employ children, and you see the birth rate plummet.
Mhm. Well, this is the thing. Once, and here's what the Fair Labor Standards Act actually says. Um, Oppressive child labor is banned in commerce or in the production of goods for commerce. Persons under 18 years of age may not be employed in mining or manufacturing or in, quote, any occupation which the Secretary of Labor shall declare to be particularly hazardous for the employment of children or detrimental to their health or well being. Otherwise, 16 years of age is the usual minimum age for employment. The Secretary may permit the employment of persons 14 to 16 years of age in work not deemed oppressive that does not interfere with schooling and it's not detrimental to health or well being. Additionally, the Secretary of Labor establishes hours during which children of various ages can work. But there are exemptions. Guess where there's an exemption?
Maybe in like agricultural labor.
Agriculture.
Yeah.
There's also an exemption for the street trades, like newspaper delivery,
Oh,
which brings me back around to Walt Disney. He
yay.
worked as a newspaper. His dad owned a newspaper route in Kansas City, and Walt Disney and his brother Roy worked as delivery boys, newspaper delivery boys.
You know where there's not an exemption either, and I don't think that it would even be put into some sort of law, but domestic servitude. I mean, kids are do all sorts of domestic labor, whether for themselves or other families. I mean, I was a hustling babysitter when I was like 13, 14, 15 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I was out
Yep.
all the time babysitting. I worked at my grandmother's daycare, taking care of kids, making food. Domestic labor is never considered actual labor, right? And that's a huge, huge problem in this country, and it's gender specific oftentimes. But there's no exemption there. There's no laws or rules about what kind of domestic servitude kids can be subject to in addition to their school labor, right?
Right. It's I'm just trying to think. I mean, I think it would be a violation of something.
If there was a statute against domestic labor.
Yeah.
Well, there's this idea though that like what happens in your house is what is your business.
Well, so here's the thing. One of the agriculture exemptions says that youths under 12 years old may perform jobs on farms owned or operated by a parent or with a parent written consent outside of school hours in non-hazardous jobs on farms not covered by minimum wage requirements.
But see, there's a fine line here between like you're just helping out the family and just doing things that your family does and child labor. I mean, to where is the line, I guess? I mean, what they're trying to say is you can't be on a tractor or something. You can't put your kid on a tractor to go plow the field or something. But there has
No,
to
but
be
you
a line
can.
too.
But
That's a
you,
hazardous job.
well, but then there's another exception.
Uh-oh.
Children of any age are allowed to work on a farm owned or operated by a parent.
Is that wrong?
I don't know. And here's the thing. I think it is. Because again, I think it is, I don't know. I think there's something about devaluing children of certain socioeconomic levels that's going on there. But here's the thing. I think one of the problems is we've never been able to satisfactorily define and value out domestic labor performed by women in the household.
That's what it comes down to.
And
When
I
we
think
have kids.
if we could do that, then you would start to move a little bit more towards, okay, well, what about situations where you have children performing some of those domestic duties? Um, if a child is required to babysit their siblings 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, that's a 20-hour job,
When
right?
so many kids do that. But where is the line though of like you're participating and functioning within a family unit and child labor? Because and the other thing too here is like kids a lot of times really like to help do things, right? Like every night the kids want to help me make dinner. Should I be like, "Oh, well, I got to clock you in for cooking dinner?" And like, like it's kind of weird when you think about it that way of like it's not labor. I'm not employing them. It's like you're teaching them a skill. But then we kind of circle back to the apprenticeship thing and how abusive that could be, right?
Well, do you think it's abusive when schools have children stand out on the street corner with boxes of candy bars and sell them?
Okay, as an adult looking back on that, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that's nuts."
I
But as
think
a
it's
kid, I
horrible.
liked doing it as a kid. I
Oh,
used to go
kids
door
love
to door.
selling stuff.
It was
Kids
so
love
fun.
selling
How
stuff.
dangerous. My parents would just send me out with, like, a box of See's candy, head on down, I mean, they'd be like, "Go to houses you know." They weren't actually, but I would go door to door to door, sometimes with my brother, sometimes not, sometimes with another kid, and we would sell candy bars to people, and I loved doing that. We would sell wrapping paper, candy bars, the Girl Scouts sold Girl Scout cookies door to door. That's what they used to do. I didn't do that, but kids like doing that. So where is the line there too? Just like they want to do it.
I don't know.
Like, do you just like
I
put them
do
in a
not know.
bubble and say like you never have to have anything hard in your entire life?
Well,
Like,
I mean,
yes.
but I mean, here's the thing: is I think that you have to balance kind of providing for their education and future employability with allowing them to be children. And I
Okay,
think
but
if
what
you've
does it
got,
mean to allow somebody to be a child? That's the crux of the argument too, because that sentiment changes over time. Because in the colonial era, there was no such thing as allowing somebody to be a child. And so this notion of childhood period is kind of brand new. And the idea that they're not supposed to contribute to the family economy, that's new. And I'm, I would never make my kids do stuff like that, obviously, because I'm conditioned, socially conditioned to our current state where children have a childhood and they play all day and they learn and, they grow and enrich and blah, blah, blah. Of course, because I'm socially conditioned to that. But it is a social construction, a recent social construction about what childhood even means and what children are deserving of. And the question that I asked you originally about what age are children? I mean, we've extended childhood well into our 20s because with insurance, right? If you think about like Obamacare, you can be on your parents' insurance until you're 26 years old. That's a huge extension of childhood, wouldn't you say?
oh yeah, I think that's I'm going to sound like an old fart now. I think it's a generational thing, though, too.
Oh, you
I
think
mean, there
that
are things.
we're just
There
not
are things.
fast enough?
Well, I think there are things that people of my generation, Generation X,
Mhm.
we wanted out from under our parents so fast that we were willing to kind of suffer and whatever was necessary to get out from under that as quickly as possible. Whereas I think subsequent generations maybe aren't. They want the freedom afforded by getting out from under their parents' control, but they want the security provided by their parents.
Well, they want financial assistance and security.
Right.
It also has to do, I mean, really, all of this has to do with a completely broken system economically, right? You are financially trapped in our current system. And so many students now are crippled by student loan debt. Like you're told you have to go out and go to college, right? You have to get this. And like most people can't pay for it. And they get strapped with all this student loan debt. And they go out into the world at 21 completely riddled with debt. Whereas when you were 21 back in the colonial era, that's when you would be freed to go out into the world and to make money, and you have no debt. Your debt is paid at 21.
I
So
thought you
I'm
were
not
talking about
making
me,
an
and I was like, I'm
argument.
not that old, Hillary.
Well, no, I'm not making an argument in that way to say that that's better, but think about that, right? That like at 21 years old during the 17th century, that's when you went out completely debt free and you had a skill and you could just go off and you already had paid it. Whereas now, when you're 21, you are just saddled with debt for years.
Could be, depending on your social class.
A lot of people in the United States are because we've moved the other thing too is like child labor still exists. We've moved it out of sight.
Right.
We don't look at it anymore. But I guarantee you the phone you have in your pocket, the microphone I'm talking on, the headphones, the computer, whatever, some process by which these devices were made is at the hands of child labor from another country. Child labor doesn't go away. We move it so we don't have to see it.
Right. It moves. So you're saying there's something wrong with capitalism?
I mean, I'm afraid to say it right now because the political climate's really bad.
I think
Yes,
there is
there it
something
is.
wrong
It's
with
horrible.
capitalism.
It's
I this
horrible. We're
is,
suffering
again, it's like
under
this
it.
is a I said we were turning over a new leaf this year. I think there's time we call things out. Like this is how messed up it is. I mean, just listen to what we talked about this episode about eventually the reason child labor gets formally banned in dangerous professions has little to do with the welfare of the child.
It has everything to do with profits over people.
Yes.
Yeah, at every turn. And what I would like to say though too is about the emotional looking at children, starting in the 20th century, we do start to look at their emotional needs. But then also there's a shift now where like children meet the emotional needs of parents. People have
Oh yeah.
kids not because they contribute anything, not because they're like helpful around the house or helpful around the farm. They're accessories for adults now
Yeah.
who are emotionally stunted, right? It's true.
anyway, let's so I'm looking at my notes. There's so much I didn't get to bring up. I think we're going to have an episode where we talk about kind of I wanted to talk about Horatio Alger.
There's a lot to say there too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean maybe we can have this episode where we talk about success in the Gilded Age. Um
You can
but
cut out the part where I said that people are emotionally stunted because I don't
no, I
mean
think
that in a
it's
mean way. I mean
no,
it
but I think it's I think people look for fulfillment where they can nowadays, and their children, for many people, their children are their main source of fulfillment.
yes, because the capitalistic system is crushing everybody's soul and children are delightful. Yes?
They can be.
They can, well, I would say that there's like 95% delight in them.
That's a lot.
Maybe my children are very delightful,
I
Jeffrey.
mean, 9-month olds poop a lot.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, thanks for joining us today. This has been a fun conversation, one we wanted to do for a while. I'm Jeff.
I'm Hillary.
Until next time.